When you're out of F-8s, you're out of fighters. The bumper sticker showed up on crew vans at NAS Miramar sometime around 1966. Nobody took credit for it. June of 1966, south of Hanoi. Commander Hal Marr rolled his F-8 Crusader into a MiG-17 at 400 knots and killed it with 20mm cannon fire. 4 Colt Browning Mark 12s, 280 rounds total. No Sidewinder, no Sparrow, guns. The MiG came apart at close range, pieces of aluminum tumbling through monsoon air that smelled like aviation fuel and cordite even at 12,000 feet. Marr's wingman, Lieutenant Commander Phil Vampatella, killed another MiG 1760 seconds later. Same method, cannon. 2 kills in under 2 minutes, both with guns, from an airframe the Pentagon had already decided belonged to the previous decade. The Crusader squadrons would finish Vietnam with 19 confirmed air-to-air kills. 14 of those came from the supposedly obsolete gun package, the F-4 Phantom, the Navy's future, the missile-only thoroughbred that cost 3 times as much, managed a kill ratio of 2.4 to 1 over the same period. The Crusaders' ratio ran north of 6 to 1. If you flew Crusaders or worked the deck when they launched, that ratio belongs to you as much as any history book. Hit subscribe and leave a comment, because these numbers belong somewhere louder than a footnote. The F-8 should not have still existed by 1966. Vought designed it in 1952 as a day fighter, pure and simple, 1 engine, 1 seat, a variable incidence wing that tilted 7 degrees on takeoff so the pilot could actually see the carrier deck. An engineering solution so bizarre that Chance Vaught's own test pilots called it the Gator for the way the nose gaped open during approach. First flight, March of 1955. It broke 1,000 miles per hour on its maiden sortie. John Glenn, yes, that John Glenn, set a transcontinental speed record in one 2 years later, 3 hours and 23 minutes from Los Alamitos to Floyd Bennett Field. By 1962, the Navy considered it finished. The Phantom carried 8 missiles and a backseater with a radar scope. The Crusader carried 4 missiles it didn't trust and 4 cannons it did. Pentagon procurement logic said the gunfight ended in Korea. Doctrine called for beyond visual range engagements at 20 miles. Clean, antiseptic. No turning, no merging, just radar locks and missile smoke at distances where you never saw the other pilot's helmet. The skies over North Vietnam had a different opinion. Russell Clark, Vaught's chief of aerodynamics, stood on the tarmac at Edwards in March of 1955, watching the prototype taxi, and smelled hydraulic fluid leaking from the wing pivot mechanism. The whole concept lived or died on that pivot. Every other supersonic fighter design solved the carrier approach visibility problem by giving the pilot a longer nose gear, which meant a heavier airframe, which meant a weaker thrust-to-weight ratio. Clark's team threw that logic out. They hinged the entire wing. 7 degrees doesn't sound like much. It redefined how the airplane met the air. Wing tilted up. The fuselage stayed level during approach. Pilot looked straight down the deck instead of guessing where it ended behind a raised nose. Wing locked flat at altitude. The F-8 became a clean supersonic platform with the smallest frontal cross-section of any Navy fighter in service. 2 configurations from 1 airframe. The mechanism added 420 pounds. Vaught's engineers argued that weight bought more capability than 400 pounds of extra missile rail ever could. The guns stayed because John Hoskins insisted. Hoskins ran the Navy's fighter requirements desk in 1953. The Air Force had already committed to the missile-only F-106. Hoskins read the Korean combat reports, the ones showing that 60% of MiG kills happened inside gun range, under 2,000 feet of slant distance, and wrote the requirement for 4 20mm cannons into the Crusader spec. The Colt Mark 12 fired 1,000 rounds per minute per barrel. 4 barrels. A 2-second burst put 80 rounds into a cone the size of a garage door at 1,000 feet. The Mark 12's shells weighed just over a quarter pound each and carried enough high-explosive incendiary fill to punch through a MiG-17's armor plate at convergence range. Pentagon analysts called the gun package dead weight. Missiles killed at 10 miles. Why carry cannons for a fight that doctrine said would never happen? Hoskins retired in 1959. He didn't live to see Hal Marr's gun camera footage from '66, but the requirement he wrote, 4 cannons, 280 rounds, put 14 North Vietnamese MiGs into the jungle floor. 1965 through 1968. The AIM-7 Sparrow achieved a kill probability of 8% in combat over North Vietnam. 8. The manufacturer's brochure promised 71. The Sidewinder did better, 15%, still less than 1 in 6. A Crusader pilot carrying 2 Sidewinders and 2 Sparrows had, statistically, a coin flip chance that any single missile would guide at all. Motor ignition failures, seeker heads distracted by sun glint off rice paddies, fins that didn't deploy. We had missiles that acted like they'd rather not, Commander Dick Schaffert told debriefers after a '67 mission where 2 AIM-9s corkscrewed into empty sky. The Mark 12 cannon hit what the pilot pointed it at. A sidebar on the F-8, the Reconnaissance Crusader. October of 1962, Lieutenant Commander William Ecker flew unarmed photo runs over Cuba at treetop altitude, bringing back the imagery that proved Soviet missiles set 90 miles from Key West. The name Crusader stuck to reconnaissance because no other airframe combined the speed, the low-altitude stability, the structural tolerance, and the sheer cockpit visibility to pull it off. 6 F-8 pilots earned distinguished flying crosses in 13 days over Cuba. Same wing pivot, same Pratt & Whitney J-57. No guns, no missiles, just cameras and nerve. Back to the gun. A 2-second burst cost the Navy $6 in ammunition. A Sparrow cost $43,000. At 8% reliability, the cost per kill with a Sparrow ran over $500,000 in 1966 money. The 20mm cannon averaged under 900. The accountants never mentioned that. I shot him with everything I had, and he just sat there burning. Then he rolled over and went in. Lieutenant Commander Bobby Lee, VF-24, July of 1967. His voice on the debrief tape sounds like a man ordering lunch. The engagements got closer as the war ground on. MiG-17 pilots from the 923rd Fighter Regiment learned to avoid the Phantom's missile envelope by pressing inside 2,000 feet, right where the F-4 had nothing left. The Crusader lived there. Commander Richard Bellinger killed a MiG-21 in May of '67 by closing to 800 feet and firing 104 rounds. The MiG pilot, sources conflict on whether he ejected, had turned into Bellinger expecting a missile shot. He got cannon shells instead. By 1968, VF-211 alone had 5 kills. The squadron's maintenance chief kept a hand-painted scoreboard on the ready room bulkhead. 5 red stars. 19 total Crusader kills. 3 losses in air-to-air combat. A ratio above 6-to-1 against pilots trained by Soviet instructors flying Soviet aircraft in Soviet-designed tactical formations. The F-4 community flew more sorties, carried more ordnance, dominated the bombing mission. Nobody disputes that. But when the fight collapsed to knife range, when the radars cluttered and the missiles corkscrewed, when the RWR wouldn't stop screaming, the single-seat, single-engine, cannon-armed fighter from 1952 did what 60 years of procurement logic said couldn't happen anymore. NAS Miramar, 1976. The last Fleet Crusaders flew off Hancock's deck and taxied to the Boneyard line at Davis-Monthan. 21 years of service. The airframe smelled like JP-5 and old rubber. The cockpit seals had baked in tropical heat across 3 combat cruises and never got replaced. 55 Crusader pilots died in the air war over Vietnam, not all in air-to-air. AMs, AAA, operational losses, night carrier approaches in monsoon weather with a variable incidence wing that sometimes stuck. The ejection seat worked, sometimes it didn't. The gun came back. The F-4E model, the one the Air Force flew starting in '72, carried an internal M61 Vulcan cannon. 6 barrels, 6,000 rounds per minute. The Navy resisted longer, kept the missile-only Phantom through the end of the war. But when they wrote the spec for the F-14 Tomcat, paragraph 3 of the weapons requirement read, internal gun, 20mm, 675 rounds minimum. The F-15 followed suit, then the F-16, then the F-18. Every American fighter designed after Vietnam carried a cannon, every single one. Hoskins wrote that requirement in '53. The Navy spent 13 years trying to prove him wrong. The 923rd Fighter Regiment, Bellinger's opponents, lost 17 pilots in engagements with Crusaders and Phantoms between '66 and '68. Nguyen Van Bay, their leading ace, credited the F-8 as the most dangerous American fighter he faced, not the fastest or the most advanced, the one whose pilots pressed to gun range and stayed there. Van Bay reportedly told Soviet advisors the Crusader fought like a MiG, close, aggressive, committed to the merge. He meant it as professional respect. The Soviet advisors noted it in a tactical assessment that stayed classified until 1993. VF-211, decommissioned in March of 1975. The squadron's last commanding officer, Commander Jim Blessinger, signed the paperwork, locked the ready room, drove home. The 5 red stars on the bulkhead went to a warehouse at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. The records don't say whether they survived. The Tomcat squadrons at Miramar inherited the mission, the parking spots, the maintenance hangars. Different airplane, heavier, 2 seats, Phoenix missiles that could kill at 100 miles. Also, a Vulcan cannon bolted under the nose. On a Tuesday morning in October of 1976, an F-14 from VF-142 launched off Enterprise for a routine combat air patrol over the Indian Ocean. The pilot checked his weapons panel, radar, sidewinders, sparrows, gun. He selected gun first.